The sun was setting over the small town of Brooksville, casting a warm golden hue over the quiet streets. It was an ordinary day. Nothing unusual for the people who lived here. The air was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. For twins Marcus and Malik Johnson, it was just another afternoon after school. They had spent their day at Brooksville High, laughing together between classes and sharing their usual dreams of the future. Marcus, the older of the two by just a few minutes, had always been the more outgoing one, always quick to crack a joke or take the lead. Malik, on the other hand, was quieter, thoughtful, often lost in books or his art. But their bond was unshakable. They were more than brothers. They were best friends. After school, the two walked side by side down Main Street, heading towards their favorite spot, the corner store. They'd been there 100 times before, a place where the owner, Mr. Allen, always greeted them with a smile and a joke. Marcus tossed a few coins in the air, catching them with a grin, while Malik gazed at the sky, thinking about a new painting he'd been working on. The town felt safe, peaceful, but peace was fragile here, as it always is when history weighs heavy on the present. Unbeknownst to the twins, something was about to shatter that calm. Officer Michael Daniels, a man who had patrolled the streets of Brooksville for years, had been keeping a close eye on them. Daniels was a man with a reputation for being quick to judge, especially when it came to young black men. His prejudice wasn't hidden. It was spoken about in hushed tones among the townsfolk. Some dismissed it, others were too afraid to speak out. But for Marcus and Malik, the tension was a silent shadow that followed them everywhere. It wasn't anything unusual for Officer Daniels to stop people on the street. He had done it countless times before. But there was something about the twins that rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was their confident stride, or the fact that they never cowered in the face of authority. Maybe it was just that they were black, and in his mind, that made them suspicious. He had no reason to stop them that day. No probable cause, but that didn't matter. He saw them walking, laughing, and he made his decision. "Hey!" Daniels shouted from his squad car, his voice cutting through the calm evening air. Marcus and Malik froze, turning toward the officer, confusion written on their faces. "What are you two doing here? Move along, or I'll have to arrest you for loitering." The twins exchanged a look. "We're just walking home," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. Daniel stepped out of his car, glaring at them with disdain. "I don't want to hear it. You're causing a disturbance. Get in the car now." The twins stood their ground. "We didn't do anything wrong," Malik replied, his voice tinged with frustration but controlled. But Daniels wasn't listening. The power he wielded, the authority he felt, made him deaf to their words. His jaw tightened, and he reached for his handcuffs, clearly intending to force compliance. Marcus, ever protective of his brother, stepped forward. "We didn't do anything. Why are you harassing us?" That was enough to set Daniels off. "You're not going anywhere," he barked. In a flash, he grabbed Marcus by the arm, yanking him toward the squad car. Malik instinctively stepped forward to protect his brother, but Daniels was faster. He shoved Malik back, sending him stumbling onto the sidewalk. The twins were now face to face with an officer who had no intention of hearing their side. The scene was escalating quickly. People had begun to notice, watching from their windows and doorways, but no one stepped forward. In a town like Brooksville, where the police were the law, most people stayed silent. Marcus and Malik, now standing handcuffed in the back of Daniel's squad car, exchanged a look. Their world had just changed. They were scared, confused, but they weren't backing down. As the car doors slammed shut, Daniels climbed into the driver's seat. He didn't notice the growing crowd behind him, nor did he care. His mind was already set. The twins were trouble, and he was going to teach them a lesson. The engine roared to life, and the officer pulled away, the car disappearing into the distance. What had started as an ordinary day for Marcus and Malik had now turned into something neither of them would ever forget. And as the car sped off toward the police station, there was an eerie sense in the air, as though the entire town could feel the storm that was about to break. For the twins, it was just the beginning of a nightmare. For Officer Daniels, it was the start of a chain of events that would bring the town to its knees. No one could have predicted what would happen next. The sound of the squad car's engine faded as Officer Daniels drove further into the night, leaving behind a town that was still quiet, but not for long. In the town of Brooksville, news spread fast. Within minutes, whispers began circulating through the streets. At first, it was just a few people murmuring at the corner store, but soon, the rumor reached every corner of the town. Marcus and Malik Johnson, the quiet twins known for their polite manner and strong family values, had been arrested by Officer Daniels. The reason? Nothing more than walking down Main Street. Inside the small, dingy holding cell at the police station, the twins sat side by side, trying to make sense of the whirlwind they had just entered. The cold steel walls felt like a prison all on their own, and the sound of their breathing echoed louder than the bustling city outside. Malik, ever the thinker, ran his fingers through his short hair, his mind racing. He kept telling himself this would be over soon. His mother would be here any minute. She'd make sure they got out of this mess. But the knots in his stomach wouldn't loosen. Marcus sat in silence, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. He was furious, but a part of him couldn't believe what was happening. They had done nothing wrong. They were just walking home from school, like they had done 1,000 times before. It wasn't long before the doors of the cell clanged open, and a tall, lanky officer stepped inside. He looked down at the twins with a cold expression, his eyes revealing nothing. "You're lucky it's just a minor charge," he muttered, "but don't think this will go unnoticed. You'll be lucky if the chief doesn't have more for you after this." The twins exchanged a quick glance, both silently wondering what exactly was going to happen next. Meanwhile, in the town, the news was beginning to spiral out of control. By the time their mother, Vanessa Johnson, received the phone call, she was already in the middle of preparing dinner. She had no idea that her sons, her pride and joy, were sitting behind bars. When she heard the news, everything stopped. She grabbed her coat and rushed out the door without a word. She'd always taught Marcus and Malik that they would have to work harder than most to prove their worth in a world that didn't always see them for who they were. She had no idea how far that lesson would be put to the test. As Vanessa approached the police station, her mind raced. She knew Officer Daniels and had heard the stories, but nothing had ever prepared her for this moment. The doors to the station were heavy, almost as if they were trying to keep her out. When she stepped inside, the cool air of the station sent a chill down her spine. She could feel the weight of the room, the tension, the history, the distrust. She'd seen enough to know that nothing was ever easy when it came to the police in Brooksville. As she demanded to see her sons, the officers behind the desk tried to assure her that everything would be fine. But Vanessa knew better. She wasn't going to let this slide. She couldn't. "Where are they?" Vanessa asked, her voice steely, though a flicker of fear ran beneath the surface. "I want to see my boys. Now." The officer behind the desk hesitated for a moment, then pointed down the narrow hall to the holding cells. Vanessa nodded and walked past him, every step heavier than the last. The thought of her sons, handcuffed and trapped behind bars, made her heart ache. She had always known that life wouldn't be easy for them, but this was something she couldn't have prepared for. When she reached the cell, she saw them. They looked up as she approached, their faces lighting up with relief, but also tinged with confusion. "Mama, what's going on?" Marcus asked, his voice quieter than usual. "We didn't do anything wrong." Vanessa smiled at them, though it was a strained, tight smile. "I know, baby. I know." She stood there for a moment, trying to hold herself together before she spoke again. "But we're going to fix this. Don't you worry." As Vanessa fought for her son's release, the rest of the town began to stir. The town hall erupted in a storm of phone calls, arguments, and heated conversations. At the diner, patrons couldn't help but overhear the discussions, their voices rising in anger as they talked about the arrest. The older generation, many of whom had witnessed or been part of the town's darker history, exchanged knowing looks. They had seen this happen before, with other young black men in town. But this was different. The Johnson twins were well-liked, they were respected, and this arrest felt like a slap in the face to the entire community. Across town, a small group of activists, many of them lifelong residents, began to organize a protest. They had seen enough injustice in Brooksville, and this latest incident felt like the tipping point. Marcus and Malik were good kids, the kind of young men the town needed to be proud of. It didn't matter that they were black. It didn't matter that Officer Daniels had chosen to target them. What mattered was the truth, and it was slowly coming to light. By the time the protesters arrived at the police station, the energy in the air was palpable. They were determined, fired up, and ready to demand justice for the twins. The chants grew louder with each passing minute, their voices blending together into a powerful, unified call. "Free the Johnson twins," they cried. "Justice for Marcus and Malik." Inside the station, Officer Daniels watched the growing crowd from his window. He'd seen protests before, but this one felt different. He was used to being the authority figure, used to being above reproach. But as the crowd outside swelled, he felt something shifting in the air. He was starting to understand that this wasn't just about him. This was about something much bigger, something he couldn't control. Back in the holding cell, the twins remained silent as they listened to the distant sounds of the protest. It felt surreal, like something out of a dream. They had never imagined that their simple walk down Main Street would lead to all of this. The anger, the injustice, the chaos. It was all unfolding before them, and they were powerless to stop it. But Marcus wasn't going to just sit there. He couldn't. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. He clenched his fists, then looked at his brother, his eyes burning with resolve. "We're getting out of here," he whispered. Malik nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. They weren't just going to let this go. They had to fight back. For themselves, for their family, and for their community. And in the moments that followed, a quiet understanding passed between them. They didn't know how it would play out, but they knew this was the beginning of something bigger. This wasn't just about their arrest anymore. It was about standing up against the injustice that had been allowed to fester for so long. The twins had no idea that what was coming would change their lives and their town forever. The sun had long set, casting a cold, unforgiving darkness over the streets of Brooksville. The tension was thick in the air, and the protests outside the police station hadn't slowed down. If anything, they had only grown louder and more determined. The chanting had turned into a call for action. Justice for Marcus and Malik echoed from the steps of the station, but inside, the mood was anything but unified. The officers were growing uneasy, the sight of the protesters outside rattling even the most hardened among them. Officer Daniels, still behind the desk in his small, dimly lit office, could feel the walls closing in on him. He had spent his career enforcing order, holding a belief that his badge gave him the right to wield power over the people, but now, for the first time, he felt like he was losing control. Daniels leaned back in his chair, staring at the stack of paperwork in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. The arrest of Marcus and Malik had seemed like a routine act of authority at first, but now, as the protesters' voices reached him, his confidence started to crumble. He'd been accused of racism before, sure, but this was different. The twins had been good boys. Everyone in town knew them. They were not troublemakers. The realization hit him hard. The people were watching, and this time, his actions couldn't be swept under the rug. He'd made a mistake. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Sergeant Thompson, a man Daniels had known for years. Thompson had always been one to keep his head down, never too involved in anything that could stir up trouble. But tonight, his expression was one of quiet concern. "Daniels, "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Daniels didn't respond immediately, just gave him a tight nod, as if he already knew what was coming. He'd been expecting this. "I know what you're going to say," Daniels muttered, running a hand through his hair. "The protests, the noise. It's nothing. It'll blow over." "It's not just about the protests, Mike," Thompson said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "It's about the way things are looking right now. The public, hell, even some of the other officers, are starting to question what happened. We can't just ignore it." Daniels shot him a glare. "I did my job, Thompson. They were causing trouble. I was doing what I'm supposed to do." "No, you weren't," Thompson said, his voice a little sharper. "And you know it. This isn't just about the twins. This is about a pattern of behavior that's been going on for too long. People are starting to talk, and the chief isn't happy. If you don't do something now to make this right, it's going to cost you everything." The words hit Daniels like a punch in the gut. He'd always believed he was above reproach, that his badge made him untouchable. But now, the realization was sinking in. The town was turning on him. His reputation, his career, everything he'd worked for was crumbling before his eyes. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Daniels said, his voice softer now. I know," Thompson interrupted, "but it's happening. And you need to make it right, or you're done." The sergeant left the office, his footsteps heavy as he walked away, leaving Daniels to wrestle with the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, outside, the protest was growing. Vanessa Johnson, Marcus and Malik's mother, had arrived just moments before, her face hard with determination. She had been speaking to the media, telling her story over and over, and it was clear the town was rallying behind her and her sons. For the first time, it seemed like people were ready to listen. The noise from the protesters became louder as the crowd swelled, their signs raised high, their voices calling for justice. But inside the station, it was a different story. The pressure was mounting, and Daniels knew he couldn't keep up the facade for much longer. He had made the wrong call, and now his every decision was under a microscope. As the hours passed, the situation grew more dire. Daniels sat at his desk, his mind spinning. He was out of options. He had no way to undo what had happened, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had crossed a line. His racist tendencies, his quickness to target the twins, were now on full display, and there was no escaping the fallout. At that moment, a call came in from the chief of police. Daniels picked up the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. "Daniels, it's time," the chief's voice crackled through the receiver. "I need you to come down here. Now." The officer's stomach twisted in knots. He stood up slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. He knew what was coming, but he wasn't ready to face it. He'd always prided himself on his authority, his ability to handle any situation. But now, as he walked through the halls of the police station, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had built was falling apart. When he arrived at the chief's office, the door swung open, and he was met with the cold, disapproving gaze of Chief Harris, a man known for his unwavering dedication to the law. At least, that was the public face he showed. In private, however, Harris had his own reservations about some of the department's more questionable practices. "Sit down, Daniels," Harris said without looking up from the stack of papers on his desk. "You've got some explaining to do." Daniels took a deep breath and sat down, his back straight but his hands trembling. He had no idea what to expect next, but it wasn't good. As Harris shuffled through the papers, Daniels could feel the weight of the moment. The chief wasn't going to let this slide. His actions had gone too far. "What the hell were you thinking?" Harris asked finally, looking up at Daniels with cold, calculating eyes. "You arrested two good boys. Twins, for God's sake. And now we have a town up in arms. This isn't just about you anymore. This is bigger. We've got the press circling, and the last thing we need is another scandal." Daniels opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. There were no excuses left. The evidence of his bias, his overreach, was undeniable. All he could do now was wait for Harris to pass judgment. "Listen," Harris continued, his voice lowering. "I've covered for you before. But this time you've gone too far. You need to fix this. The twins need to be released, and we need to do some damage control. If you can't manage that, then you might as well pack your bags now." Daniel swallowed hard, his pride and guilt warring within him. He had made a mistake, a costly, unforgivable mistake. But now he had no choice. He had to make things right, not just for the twins, but for himself. The fate of his career and his soul was in his hands. What came next was anyone's guess. But one thing was for sure. The storm that had started with a simple arrest wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The next few hours were a blur for Officer Daniels. The weight of the chief's words clung to him like a heavy fog. His every thought, his every move, was tainted by the overwhelming reality of his situation. He had never felt so isolated. The walls of the police station, which had once felt like a sanctuary of power and control, now seemed to close in around him. The protest outside was only growing louder, and for the first time, Daniels couldn't ignore the public outrage. He had made a mistake, and it was becoming glaringly clear that the consequences were going to be severe. He was sitting in his car, parked a block away from the station, staring out at the growing crowd. His mind was racing. He knew what was coming, knew that there was no way out of this mess. There was no way to undo what had happened. The video footage of the arrest had already surfaced online, and it wasn't just the twins' families and friends who were angry. People from outside Brooksville, people who had never even heard of the town, were now watching. The incident had gone viral. The hashtag Justice for Marcus and Malik was trending, and the town was under a microscope. His past actions, his biases, were being laid bare for the world to see. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had allowed his prejudices to dictate his actions. He had arrested those boys not because they had done anything wrong, but because he had assumed they were guilty the moment he laid eyes on them. He had let his own biases shape the narrative, and now he was paying the price. Inside the station, the officers were beginning to take sides. Some were sympathetic to the twins, quietly discussing the injustice of it all. Others, however, still stood by Daniels, convinced that he had acted in the best interests of law and order. But as the hours wore on, it became clear that this wasn't a situation that could be swept under the rug. The town was divided, and the pressure on the police department was unbearable. Everyone had their opinions, but no one seemed to agree on what needed to happen next. Vanessa Johnson, Marcus and Malik's mother, had not stopped fighting. She had spoken to the media, attended every protest, and made sure that the voices of the community were heard. She wasn't going to let her sons be treated like criminals simply because of the color of their skin. Her voice had become a beacon for the community, a rallying cry for justice. And as she stood outside the police station that night, her face illuminated by the harsh glow of the streetlights, she felt a sense of determination wash over her. She had been a mother before she was anything else, and she would not let her children suffer in silence. They were not the criminals here. Officer Daniels was. As the evening wore on, the town hall convened a special meeting to address the situation. It was supposed to be a routine meeting, one where local business owners and community leaders would gather to discuss upcoming town plans. But that night, the only topic on the agenda was the arrest of Marcus and Malik Johnson. The meeting quickly devolved into chaos, with passionate speeches being made from both sides. Some residents stood up, demanding that Officer Daniels be removed from his position. Others, the more conservative members of the town, called for patience, insisting that Daniels had simply done his job. But the division in the room was palpable. The town was no longer unified. The issue had exposed a deeper, long-standing racial tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. In the midst of the meeting, an unexpected voice rose above the rest. A local attorney, one who had been quietly observing the proceedings, stood up and spoke. "I've been practicing law in Brooksville for over 20 years, she began, her voice steady but firm. "And I can tell you right now that this incident is not just about one officer. This is about the system that has allowed this kind of behavior to continue unchecked for far too long. It's about the bias that permeates every corner of our town. And it's about time we did something about it." Her words struck a chord with the crowd. The room fell silent as people processed what she had said. It wasn't just about Officer Daniels anymore. It was about the broader problem. The racism that had plagued the town, the unequal treatment of its black residents, and the systemic issues that had been ignored for generations. The attorney's speech marked a turning point in the meeting. People were beginning to understand that this wasn't just a case of an officer gone rogue. It was a symptom of a larger disease that needed to be addressed. Back at the police station, Daniels was summoned to a meeting with his superiors. He had been expecting it, but that didn't make it any easier. His hands trembled as he sat across from Chief Harris, who was flanked by two higher-ranking officers. The chief didn't mince words. "You've put us in an impossible situation, Daniels," he said, his voice sharp. "The pressure from the community is overwhelming. The public is demanding accountability, and we're going to have to take action." Daniels swallowed hard, but he didn't say anything. He knew that whatever was coming, it wouldn't be good. The chief continued, his eyes cold and calculating. "You're suspended, effective immediately. We're going to launch an internal investigation into the incident, and don't fool yourself into thinking you can weasel your way out of this. The evidence is against you, and the town isn't going to let this go." For the first time in his career, Daniels felt a chill of fear. He had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots. But now his world was crumbling. His badge, once a symbol of authority, felt like a weight he could no longer bear. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Outside, the protesters were still chanting, their voices rising in unison. The energy in the air was electric, and as Daniels walked out of the station, he could feel the eyes of the crowd on him. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. He wasn't the one calling the shots. The anger in the eyes of the protesters, the collective power of the community, was a force he couldn't ignore. Vanessa Johnson was among them, standing tall with a fire in her eyes. She had fought for her sons, and now she was fighting for something bigger. Her voice rang out over the crowd as she called for justice, not just for Marcus and Malik, but for everyone who had been wronged by a system that had long been rigged against them. Officer Daniels didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change forever. Karma had already begun to strike, and in the coming days, he would come to understand just how far-reaching the consequences of his actions would be. The days that followed were a blur of activity, protests, and growing tension. Officer Daniels was suspended, his badge stripped from him, and his reputation in tatters. He had been the embodiment of authority in Brooksville, but now he was a pariah. The people he had once commanded were now openly hostile, and his every movement was watched, judged, and criticized. He had never felt so alone, and as the reality of his situation set in, the weight of his mistakes grew heavier with each passing moment. Vanessa Johnson, on the other hand, had become the face of the movement for justice in Brooksville. What had started as a desperate mother fighting for the release of her sons had transformed into a rallying cry for a community that had suffered under systemic racism for far too long. Her speeches had garnered media attention, and she became a symbol of strength and resilience. People from all over the country were reaching out, offering support, and sharing their own stories of injustice. But despite the overwhelming support, Vanessa's focus remained on one thing: holding Officer Daniels accountable for his actions and ensuring that no other family had to endure what hers had. For Marcus and Malik, the experience had been transformative. While they were physically released from the holding cell, the emotional scars of the ordeal remained. They were no longer the carefree teenagers who had walked down Main Street without a care in the world. The weight of the world had settled on their shoulders, and they were now keenly aware of the realities of racial injustice. The town that had once been their home felt different now, less safe, more divided. They had witnessed firsthand the deep fissures that lay beneath the surface of Brooksville, and while they had always known that racism existed, they had never truly understood the depth of it until now. As the protests continued, the public pressure on the police department intensified. The media coverage was relentless, with reporters camping outside the police station, waiting for any new developments. Social media was flooded with posts, videos, and stories that painted Officer Daniels as the face of a corrupt system. His past, long buried in the archives of the town's history, was now being dragged into the light. It wasn't just his treatment of Marcus and Malik that people were condemning. It was the years of unjust arrests, racial profiling, and abuse of power that he had wielded with impunity. The community, once divided, was now united in their demand for justice. The legal proceedings began, and for the first time, Officer Daniels was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. His attorney tried to mount a defense, claiming that Daniels had acted in good faith, but the evidence was overwhelming. The video footage of the arrest, the testimonies from witnesses, and the mounting public outrage left little room for him to argue. Daniels had no choice but to watch as his life unraveled before his eyes. His job, his dignity, and his identity as a lawman had been taken from him. But more than that, the realization hit him that his actions had caused irreparable harm to an entire community. His arrogance and prejudice had led to the suffering of two innocent young men, and the repercussions of that would echo far beyond the courthouse. As the trial approached, the town of Brooksville began to feel the weight of its own transformation. What had once been a town that turned a blind eye to racial injustice was now waking up. The protests had sparked conversations that had been long overdue. People were no longer content to sit in silence and watch as others suffered. Brooksville was changing, and the question on everyone's mind was whether it could ever go back to the way it was before. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. Vanessa and the twins sat in the front row, their eyes fixed on the proceedings. The prosecutor's words were powerful, condemning Officer Daniels for the way he had treated the twins, for the way he had abused his power. But it wasn't just about the twins anymore. It was about the larger issue of police accountability, the systemic racism that had been allowed to fester in Brooksville for far too long. The courtroom was packed with people who had come to witness history being made. It wasn't just the Johnson family who was affected, it was the entire town. The people of Brooksville had a chance to do something they had never done before: stand up for what was right. As the trial dragged on, Daniels sat quietly at the defense table, his face a mask of defeat. He had lost everything: his career, his respect, and most painfully, his sense of self. He had spent his life building a reputation as a hard-nosed cop, someone who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. But in the end, it wasn't his strength or his authority that had defined him. It was his own biases and prejudices. And now he was paying the price. The verdict came down in a swift, resounding judgment. Officer Daniels was guilty of misconduct, abuse of power, and racial discrimination. The sentence was harsh. He would face both criminal charges and civil lawsuits, and his career in law enforcement was officially over. The courtroom erupted in applause as the verdict was read. But for Vanessa, Marcus, and Malik, the feeling was bittersweet. They had won, but the victory didn't bring back the innocence that had been stolen from them. It didn't undo the trauma that they had endured. But it was a start. It was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for their family, but for the entire town of Brooksville. The community that had once stood divided was now coming together in ways that no one had imagined possible. People who had once kept their heads down, too afraid to speak out, were now standing up and demanding change. Brooksville was beginning to reckon with its past, and in doing so was moving toward a future that was more just, more equitable. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be many more battles to fight. But the seeds of change had been planted, and they were starting to take root. For Marcus and Malik, the road ahead would not be easy. They had been forever changed by the events that had unfolded, and they knew that their journey was far from over. But they were no longer the frightened boys who had been arrested that day. They were young men who had seen the ugly side of the world, but who had also learned the power of resilience, the strength of community, and the importance of fighting for what was right. Their story was far from over, and they knew that their voices, now louder than ever, would continue to echo through the streets of Brooksville, demanding justice for all. As the trial ended and the town began to heal, one question lingered in the air. How many more lives had to be shattered before real change was made? And for the people of Brooksville, it was clear that the fight for justice was just beginning. In the days following the trial, Brooksville began to breathe again. The courthouse, which had been a symbol of tension and uncertainty for so long, now stood as a testament to what the town had just endured and overcome. For Marcus and Malik, the world they once knew had been irrevocably altered. They could no longer walk through Brooksville without feeling the weight of the history they had become a part of. People looked at them differently now, some with admiration, others with guilt or shame. They were no longer just two ordinary teenagers. They were symbols of resistance, of change. Their mother, Vanessa, had become a local hero, a fierce advocate for justice and accountability, a voice for the unheard. But for all the victories, there was still an underlying sense of exhaustion, a realization that the battle was not over. The months after the trial were filled with difficult conversations, both personal and public. The community, for the first time in a long time, began to reckon with its own history, and the twin brothers were at the forefront of that reckoning. People approached them in the street, some offering apologies, others extending their gratitude, while some still hung their heads in shame, unable to look them in the eye. In every conversation, there was a sense of awkwardness, as if no one knew quite what to say after what had happened. The town was fractured, but the divide had been exposed, and there was no going back. Marcus and Malik, however, did their best to navigate the tension. They had both decided that this wasn't just a battle for their own dignity, but a responsibility to the generations that came before them and to the ones that would follow. Vanessa, meanwhile, took the lessons she had learned in the heat of the battle and turned them into action. She began working with local organizations, pushing for police reform, better educational opportunities for the town's youth, and more inclusive community programs. She knew that real change wasn't just about one victory in a courtroom. It was about transforming a culture, one decision at a time. While Officer Daniels sat in the shadows, facing the consequences of his actions, Vanessa and her sons were in the light, shaping the future of Brooksville. The town began to take small but meaningful steps toward reconciliation. The first was the creation of a community forum where residents could discuss race, policing, and justice without fear of retribution. It wasn't always easy. There were arguments, misunderstandings, and moments of anger, but the town slowly began to understand that in order to heal, they had to confront the difficult truths about the past. Slowly, the conversations grew more productive, and in the years that followed, Brooksville saw an increase in voter turnout, a stronger relationship between the police and the community, and a youth movement that demanded better education and opportunities for everyone, not just the privileged few. But the real change happened at a much deeper level. As the protests faded and the media cameras turned their attention elsewhere, Brooksville's residents began to reflect on their own biases. People who had once been silent about racial injustice started speaking out. Those who had remained complacent began to challenge the system in ways they never had before. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't fast, but the shift was undeniable. The example set by Marcus, Malik, and their mother had planted a seed that grew into something powerful and far-reaching. And with each passing day, that seed continued to grow, slowly but surely, until it was a tree deeply rooted in the soil of Brooksville's future. In the Johnson household, things were far from easy. Marcus and Malik had seen the depths of injustice, and they had felt the sting of fear and anger, but they had also learned the importance of standing up for what was right. Their experiences shaped them into young men who understood the power of their voices. They knew that the world was far from perfect, but they also knew that change started with them. They spent countless nights talking with their mother, sharing their thoughts and feelings, and trying to make sense of everything they had witnessed. Despite the hardships, despite the scars they would carry forever, they felt a responsibility to continue the work that had started with their arrest. They couldn't just fade into the background. Their names, their story, had become symbols of justice, of resilience, and they would honor that, no matter where life took them. It was during one of these late-night conversations that Marcus said something that would stick with both of them for the rest of their lives. "We can't change the past," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But we can change the future, and that's where we need to focus. We need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. We need to teach people how to listen." Malik, who had always been more reflective, nodded slowly. "We need to keep pushing. It's not enough just to speak out. We have to act. We have to keep fighting for the people who can't fight for themselves." Vanessa listened to her sons and smiled, a bittersweet pride welling up in her chest. "You're both right," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "This isn't just about us anymore. This is about all of us. About making sure that no one else ever has to go through what we did. About making sure that justice isn't just something we talk about, but something we live every day." The conversation was a turning point for them all. Marcus and Malik, despite the pain they had endured, had found purpose in their suffering. They had found strength in each other and in their mother's unwavering resolve. They had been through hell, but they had come out the other side stronger and more determined than ever. As the years passed, the story of Marcus, Malik, and their mother became part of the town's legacy, a reminder that no injustice is too small to fight against, that every voice matters, and that real change starts with a single step. The town of Brooksville would never be the same, and neither would they. The lessons they had learned, the struggles they had faced, had forever changed the fabric of their community. But it was just the beginning. The question remained: how far were they willing to go to ensure that the injustices of the past were never repeated? The answer, they knew, was simple: as far as it took. And in the end, that was the true legacy of the Johnson family, one of courage, resilience, and the unyielding belief that, no matter the odds, they could change the world.